At 03:15 hours on February 8, 1944, Sergeant Tommy Prince lay motionless in the frozen mud of an abandoned Italian farmhouse 200 m from a German artillery battery. He had been there for more than a day through a crack in the stone wall. He watched German soldiers move between their guns, unaware that an Ojibwe warrior from the Canadian prairies was counting their positions and relaying coordinates through 1,400 m of telephone wire stretched back to Allied lines. Prince had not eaten, he had not slept. He had watched German patrols enter the farmhouse twice, hiding in the rafters while they searched the rooms below. The cold had seeped into his bones. His muscles ached from holding the same position for hours, but he remained still, watching, waiting, reporting every movement to the artillery officers who depended on his eyes. Now, as dawn approached on his second full day in position, an artillery shell landed nearby and severed his communication wire. The line went dead. Prince was alone, cut off 200 m from enemy soldiers who would kill him if they knew he was there. Prince had a choice: stay hidden and lose contact with his unit, or walk into the open in full view of German soldiers and repair the wire. What happened in the next 4 minutes would become one of the most audacious acts of deception in the Second World War, and it would cement the reputation of a unit that had already begun to haunt the nightmares of German soldiers across Italy. A unit the Germans called Dwarts and Teufel, the Black Devils. The story of how American and Canadian soldiers earned that name begins not on a battlefield, but in the mind of a British scientist with an idea so unconventional that most military planners dismissed it as fantasy. In the spring of 1942, Geoffrey Pike worked for the British Combined Operations Command under Lord Louis Mountbatten. Pike was not a soldier, he was an inventor, an eccentric thinker known for proposals that ranged from brilliant to impossible. His latest idea fell somewhere in between. Pike envisioned a small elite force capable of striking behind enemy lines in the most hostile conditions imaginable. Winter warfare in Norway, sabotage missions in the frozen mountains of occupied Europe, attacks on hydroelectric plants and industrial facilities that conventional forces could never reach. The concept was audacious. A commando unit that could parachute into enemy territory, survive in temperatures that would freeze ordinary soldiers, climb mountains that blocked conventional armies, and fight with tactics that no enemy had encountered before. The force would need to operate in sub-zero temperatures for extended periods. They would need to ski across wilderness, scale vertical cliffs, paddle inflatable boats through freezing waters, and destroy targets miles behind enemy lines. They would work in small units without support, relying entirely on their training and each other. Prime Minister Winston Churchill approved the concept. Churchill had always favoured unconventional warfare. He had championed the creation of British commando units and encouraged any idea that might strike at the enemy in unexpected ways. But the British lacked the manpower to create such a specialised force alone. They approached the Americans with a proposal: a joint commando unit, half American and half Canadian, trained for operations that no conventional army could attempt. The idea landed on the desk of a young American officer in the War Department. His name was Robert Frederick. He was 35 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the Coast Artillery with no combat experience and no particular reputation for unconventional thinking. He had been assigned to the Operations Division, handling matters that involved multiple theaters of war. Frederick spent 12 days studying Pike's proposal. He analyzed the terrain in Norway, calculated the logistics of parachuting men and equipment into occupied territory, examined the challenges of winter warfare in conditions that would kill unprepared soldiers within hours. He wrote a 14-page report, single-spaced with maps and appendices. His conclusion was clear: the operation was impractical, the risks were too high, the logistics were impossible, the plan should be abandoned. General Dwight Eisenhower read Frederick's report carefully. Then he made an unexpected decision. He told Frederick that since he understood the concept so thoroughly, since he had identified every problem and every challenge, he would be the perfect officer to make it work. Frederick would create the force, train it, and command it. Frederick was stunned. He had written the report to kill the project. Instead, he had been handed the most unusual command in the American military. On July 9, 1942, The first Special Service Force was officially activated at Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena, Montana. The name itself was deliberately misleading. Special Service suggested entertainment troops, soldiers who performed shows to boost morale. Frederick hoped the innocuous designation would confuse enemy intelligence about the unit's true purpose. The location was chosen deliberately and carefully. The wide flat valley around Helena provided open space for parachute training with gentle terrain that would reduce injuries during practice jumps. The surrounding mountains, some reaching 9.0 ft, offered terrain for climbing and winter warfare instruction. Steep cliffs, rocky slopes, and alpine conditions would test the men in exactly the environment they would face in combat, and the brutal Montana winters would prepare them for Norway. Temperatures in Helena regularly plunged well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow accumulated for months. The wind cut through clothing and exposed flesh. If men could survive and fight in Montana in January, they could survive and fight anywhere. Frederick faced an immediate problem. He needed 800 soldiers with specific backgrounds, men who could survive in wilderness conditions, men who could navigate without roads or trails, men who could endure hardship that would break ordinary soldiers. And he needed them immediately. Recruitment advertisements went out to army posts across the United States and Canada. They asked for volunteers with experience as lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, game wardens, trappers, prospectors, and outdoorsmen. The advertisements made clear that the training would be dangerous and the missions would be hazardous. They wanted men who sought difficulty, not men who avoided it. The response exceeded expectations. Thousands applied from both countries. Frederick kept only 1 in 4 American volunteers, rejecting men who lacked the mental toughness or teamwork the missions would require. The Canadians proved exceptional. Many had already seen action at Dunkirk. They understood combat in ways that American volunteers did not. Nearly all were accepted. By August, the force was assembled. Approximately 1,800 combat troops, roughly 2/3 American and 1/3 Canadian, organized into 3 combat regiments and a service battalion. The regiments were numbered 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Each contained 2 battalions of 3 companies. The structure was deliberately flexible, designed to operate as a unified force, or break into smaller units depending on mission requirements. From the beginning, Frederick made a decision that would define the unit's character. There would be no distinction between American and Canadian soldiers. They would train together, fight together, live together, and be treated as equals in every way. They would share barracks, share meals, share hardship. They would become one unit, not 2 nationalities serving together. This was unprecedented. No combined American and Canadian military unit had ever operated this way. National armies maintained their own chains of command, their own traditions, their own identities. Frederick was creating something new, a band of brothers drawn from 2 countries, but bound by training and shared experience into something stronger than either nation could produce alone. The training that followed was unlike anything the American or Canadian armies had ever attempted. It was designed to be brutal, to push men beyond what they believed they could endure, to break those who could be broken, and forge the rest into something exceptional. Every man began parachute training within 48 hours of arrival. The abbreviated program compressed weeks of instruction into days. For most, it was their first jump. Some men refused. They were sent away. The force had no room for soldiers who could not conquer their own fear. Norwegian military instructors taught skiing and winter survival. The men practiced until they could match Norwegian army standards. They skied miles through mountain terrain, carrying weapons and equipment. They spent nights in snow caves when temperatures dropped far below 0. Mountain warfare instruction pushed them up cliffs that seemed impossible. They learned to scale vertical rock faces in darkness, to move heavy equipment up slopes that would stop conventional forces, to fight while hanging from ropes hundreds of feet above the ground. But it was the close combat training that would make them feared above all else. A martial arts expert named Dermot O'Neill arrived to teach techniques that most soldiers never learned. O'Neill had served with the Shanghai International Police, where he had encountered the most brutal forms of hand-to-hand fighting. He had studied multiple martial arts and combined them into a system designed for one purpose: killing. O'Neill showed the men how to approach silently, how to neutralize sentries without sound. He taught them to strike vital points, to break bones, to crush windpipes, to kill quickly and efficiently with hands and feet. He showed them that a trained man was a weapon even when he carried no weapons at all. The training was brutal, injuries were common, but those who remained emerged, transformed, forged into something harder than ordinary soldiers. Frederick himself helped design a weapon for the force. The V-42 Stiletto was a fighting knife with a 7 and 516 in blade, double-edged and hollow ground, designed for killing silently at close range. The blade could punch through a steel helmet with a single thrust. The pommel ended in a point that could crush a skull. Every man in the combat regiments received one and trained extensively in its use. The men also learned to use enemy weapons with the same proficiency they used their own. They disassembled and fired German rifles, machine guns, pistols, and submachine guns until they could operate them as effectively as weapons they had trained with for months. They studied German hand grenades, German explosives, German communications equipment. The logic was simple behind enemy lines. They might capture German weapons and need to use them. They might run out of American ammunition but find German supplies. They needed to be equally dangerous regardless of what they carried. They studied German tactics, German command structures, German weaknesses. They learned how German units communicated, how German officers thought, how German soldiers reacted under pressure. Know your enemy was not just a slogan. It was a survival requirement. The training continued for months, each phase building on the last. Physical conditioning pushed men to exhaustion and beyond. Classroom instruction taught them languages, map reading, intelligence gathering. Field exercises combined everything into simulated missions that tested every skill they had learned. The men who survived the training formed bonds that would last the rest of their lives. They had suffered together, bled together, pushed each other beyond limits they had not known they possessed. They trusted each other with their lives because they had already depended on each other through months of brutal preparation. During the 9 months at Fort Harrison, the citizens of Helena adopted the force. Unlike larger military towns that sometimes resented the disruption soldiers brought, Helena welcomed these unusual men into homes and families. The townspeople invited them to dinners, to church services, to dances. They treated them not as temporary occupants, but as members of the community. Some 40 of the original force members would return to Montana after the war to marry local women and build lives in the community that had embraced them. The connection between the force and Helena remained strong for decades. A bond forged in the months before they went to war, but the mission they had trained for would never happen. The planned attack on Norwegian hydroelectric plants was cancelled in the summer of 1943. Political considerations, changing strategic priorities, and the difficulty of maintaining the force behind enemy lines for extended operations led to the operation being scrubbed before it could begin. The 1st Special Service Force had become a unit without a purpose. They had trained for a specific mission that no longer existed. They were the most intensively prepared soldiers in the Allied armies, specialists in a form of warfare that apparently had no immediate application. Military bureaucracy threatened to break them up and disperse their skills across conventional units. Staff officers who did not understand unconventional warfare saw the force as an expensive anomaly that should be dissolved. The men who had endured months of brutal training faced the prospect of being scattered to regular infantry divisions where their special capabilities would be wasted. Then, in the autumn of 1943, the commander of the 5th United States Army in Italy made a request that would change everything. Lieutenant General Mark Clark faced a problem that conventional forces could not solve. His army was stalled in southern Italy, blocked by a German defensive line that stretched across the mountainous peninsula. The terrain itself was the enemy's greatest ally. Ridges and peaks channeled any advance into killing grounds covered by German guns. Every valley was a trap. Every approach was registered for artillery fire. At the center of that line stood a peak called Monte La Difensa. The mountain rose 3,000 ft above the surrounding terrain. Its slopes were covered with fortified positions, machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, and artillery emplacements. The Germans of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had positioned their defenses to cover every approach, every trail, every possible route of attack. They had months to prepare, digging deep positions into rock, laying wire, sighting weapons. The 3rd Infantry Division had tried to take the mountain in November. They attacked with courage and determination. They pushed up slopes, swept by machine gun fire and artillery. They suffered terrible casualties. After 10 brutal days of fighting, they had gained nothing. The German positions remained intact. The dead and wounded were evacuated, and the division pulled back to reorganize. Other units attacked nearby positions along the winter line and were thrown back with heavy casualties. The conventional approach was not working. The terrain gave every advantage to the defenders. Frontal assault against prepared positions in mountains meant slaughter. Clark needed something unconventional. He needed soldiers who could do what regular infantry could not. He needed men who could go where the Germans believed no one could go. The 1st Special Service Force arrived in Naples on November 19, 1943. They disembarked from transport ships into a city that bore the scars of war. Buildings had been bombed, streets were rubble. Civilians struggled to survive amid the destruction. The men of the force saw immediately that they had left training behind. This was real. Within days, Colonel Frederick was studying the terrain around Monte La Difensa, looking for a weakness the Germans had overlooked. He flew aerial reconnaissance missions, examining the mountain from every angle. He sent scouts forward to observe the German positions. He analyzed every scrap of intelligence available. He found it on the north face of the mountain. The Germans had positioned their defenses to cover the obvious routes of attack, the slopes and trails that conventional forces would use. They had dug bunkers and fighting positions facing south, southeast, and southwest. They had laid wire and registered artillery to destroy any force approaching from those directions. They had largely ignored the north face because it was a sheer cliff, a vertical wall of rock rising hundreds of feet above a narrow approach. No sane commander would attempt to climb that cliff under fire. No conventional force could move heavy weapons up such terrain. The Germans had posted only token observation on the north face. Confident that the terrain itself was defense enough, Frederick decided to climb it anyway. The assault was planned with precision born from months of training. The 2nd Regiment would scale the north face during darkness, reaching the summit before dawn. They would attack the German positions from the rear from a direction the defenders had never considered possible. Surprise would compensate for numbers. Speed would compensate for support. On the night of December 2nd, approximately 600 men from the 2nd Regiment moved into position at the base of Monte La Difensa. The commander was Lieutenant Colonel Don Williamson, a Canadian officer who had proven himself during training. The men carried weapons, ammunition, and climbing equipment. They wore soft-soled boots to reduce noise on rock. They had blackened their faces and hands with boot polish to disappear into the darkness. A massive artillery barrage preceded the assault. More than 75,000 rounds fell on the German positions, one of the largest concentrations of artillery fire in the Italian campaign to that point. The bombardment was intended to kill German defenders, but also to distract them, to keep their attention focused on the expected direction of attack while the real assault approached from behind. At 1,800 hours, the 2nd Regiment began to climb. The final approach required scaling a 1,000 ft cliff face in freezing rain. The men used ropes secured by lead climbers, pulling themselves up rock that was slick with water and ice. They moved in darkness, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. They felt for handholds, tested each foothold before committing weight, inched upward, foot by foot. No shots were fired, no alarms were raised. The Germans in their bunkers faced south, watching for the conventional attack they expected. They did not imagine that 600 men were climbing the cliff at their backs. The climb took hours. Men's hands grew numb from cold and the strain of gripping wet rock. Equipment snagged on outcroppings. The weight of weapons and ammunition dragged at their bodies, but they kept climbing, driven by training that had prepared them for exactly this kind of ordeal. By dawn on December 3rd, the lead elements of the 2nd Regiment had reached the summit behind the German main positions. The Germans woke to find American and Canadian soldiers attacking from a direction they had never considered possible. Surprise was complete. The fighting was savage and close. In the confined spaces between bunkers and fighting positions, there was no room for maneuver. Men fought hand using rifles as clubs, pistols at point-blank range, knives and fists, and anything that could kill. Forcemen used their V-42 stilettos in the way they had been trained, thrusting into vital areas, killing silently when they could, fighting desperately when they had to. They cleared bunkers with grenades tossed through firing slits and doors. They killed German soldiers who emerged to fight, and German soldiers who tried to surrender before surrender was possible. The battle was a brutal close-quarters slaughter that lasted hours. The German defenders fought back desperately, but could not organize effective resistance. Their positions had been designed to face the other direction. Their communications were disrupted. They did not understand what was happening or where the enemy was coming from. Panicked defenders fired at shadows. Some broke and ran. Others died fighting in positions that had suddenly become death traps. Within hours, Monte La Difensa fell. The 5th Army had expected the assault to take 2 or 3 days. The 1st Special Service Force captured the mountain in a single night. Allied commanders were astonished. The operation became an immediate legend within the 5th Army. Nothing in the Italian campaign had demonstrated so dramatically what specially trained soldiers could achieve. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The force held the summit against German counterattacks for days. They were exposed on the mountaintop, battered by artillery from surrounding peaks, still in German hands, unable to be resupplied except by men carrying equipment up the same cliff they had climbed in the assault. Cold, exhaustion, and enemy fire took a continuous toll. During the initial assault and the following week of fighting, the force suffered devastating casualties. 511 men were killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated from exhaustion and frostbite at La Difensa and the adjacent Monte La Difensa. The assault force from the 2nd Regiment suffered approximately 77% casualties. The dead were buried on the mountainside. The wounded were carried down the same cliff face they had climbed in darkness. Within days, the regiment that had captured the mountain could barely muster enough men to hold it. The force continued attacking. Monte La Difensa fell on December 9th, Monte Sammucro on Christmas Day, Redicosa on January 4th, Monte Maggio on January 6th, Monte Visharo on January 8th. Each peak extracted its price in blood. Each victory opened the way for conventional forces to advance. At Monte Maggio, Frederick was wounded 3 times in a single action. A shell fragment struck his eye. Shrapnel hit his body. He continued to lead from the front, refusing evacuation until the objective was secured. He had his wounds bandaged and returned to command. He would not abandon his men while fighting continued. Frederick was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during those 3 days of fighting at Montimo from January 10th through January 13th. The citation praised his courage and leadership under fire. It did not mention that he had been wounded repeatedly and refused to leave. By the time the mountain campaign ended, the 1st Special Service Force had proven it could accomplish what conventional forces could not. They had cracked the German winter line. They had taken positions that had stopped entire divisions. They had demonstrated that unconventional soldiers using unconventional methods could achieve results impossible for regular infantry. But the crucible that would create their legend still lay ahead. The mountains had tested them. Anzio would forge their reputation forever. On February 1st, 1944, the force landed at Anzio. The Anzio beachhead was supposed to outflank the German positions, blocking the Allied advance on Rome. Operation Shingle had put American and British troops ashore, 70 mi behind the main German defensive line. The plan called for rapid exploitation, a drive inland that would threaten German communications and force them to withdraw or be cut off. Instead, it had become a trap. The initial landings met little resistance, but Allied commanders hesitated, consolidating their beachhead rather than pushing inland immediately. The Germans reacted with characteristic speed and aggression. They rushed reinforcements to contain the landing. Within days, German forces surrounded the beachhead on 3 sides, pinning the Allied troops against the sea. What had been planned as a stroke that would unlock Rome became a desperate defensive battle for survival. The Allies could not break out, the Germans could not push them into the sea. The fighting devolved into static trench warfare reminiscent of the First World War. With neither side able to gain significant ground, the 1st Special Service Force was assigned to hold the right flank of the beachhead along the Mussolini Canal. The canal was a drainage project that Benito Mussolini had ordered built in the 1920s to reclaim the Pontine marshes for agriculture. It cut through flat, featureless terrain, creating a barrier between Allied and German positions that both sides used as a defensive line. On paper, the force was responsible for 13 km of front, 1/4 of the entire beachhead perimeter. This was the same length of line that the entire 3rd Infantry Division was holding elsewhere on the perimeter. A division numbered roughly 15,000 men. The 1st Special Service Force, already depleted from the mountain campaign, numbered perhaps 100. This was an impossible assignment by conventional standards. A single regiment under strength and exhausted was being asked to hold a sector that should have required 10 times as many men. Across the canal, German units included elements of the elite Hermann-Göring Division, Panzer Grenadiers who had fought on the Russian front, veterans of campaigns across Europe and North Africa. Colonel Frederick, now promoted to Brigadier General, understood that conventional defense would fail. He did not have enough men to hold the line against a determined German assault. He could not match the German firepower or numbers. Static defense meant waiting to be overwhelmed, so he changed the equation. Instead of defending, Frederick ordered his men to attack. Every night, patrols from the 1st Special Service Force crossed the Mussolini Canal and penetrated German positions. They moved in small groups, faces blackened with boot polish until they blended with the darkness. They carried their V-42 stilettos and suppressed weapons. They came in silence, appearing where the Germans least expected them. The tactics were brutal and explicitly psychological. Patrols would slip past German sentries, timing movements to avoid guards, using terrain and darkness to approach positions undetected. They would enter enemy encampments where soldiers slept, killing silently with their knives, moving from sleeping figure to sleeping figure. Sometimes they killed everyone. Sometimes they deliberately left 1 or 2 men alive so survivors could tell the others what had happened. The terror of waking to find your comrades dead around you, killed without a sound while you slept, was more valuable than additional bodies. They would take boots, equipment, and documents, proving they had been there. A German soldier who woke to find his boots missing knew that the Black Devils had stood over him while he slept, close enough to touch, close enough to kill, and had chosen to let him live this time. Sometimes they would leave calling cards. General Frederick had stickers printed with the force's insignia, a red arrowhead with the letters USA and Canada written in white. Down the side ran a message in German. Das dicke Ende kommt. The literal translation was "the thick end is coming soon." The meaning was clearer. The worst is yet to come. Forcemen placed these stickers on the bodies of dead Germans, on equipment, on bunkers, on anything that would be found by soldiers who had not seen the raids. They left them in locations where discovery was certain, spreading fear through rumors and physical evidence. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers began to report seeing shadows that disappeared when they looked directly at them. They heard sounds in the night that preceded death. They found sentries with their throats cut, killed without a sound while supposedly on watch. They found comrades who had died in their sleep, V-42 wounds in their chests. They found the stickers and knew that the Black Devils had been among them. The Hermann-Göring Division, one of Germany's elite formations, veterans of campaigns across multiple theaters, was forced to pull back its positions nearly a kilometer to avoid the nightly raids. They withdrew from defensible terrain, surrendered ground they had held for weeks, simply to put more distance between themselves and the men who came in darkness. German commanders offered a 10-day furlough, a significant reward in an army where leave was rare, to any soldier who could capture one of the Black Devils alive. They wanted prisoners to interrogate, to understand how these Americans and Canadians operated, to find weaknesses that could be exploited. None ever claimed the reward. The Black Devils did not surrender. They did not get captured. They came, they killed, and they vanished. Within weeks of the force taking over the Mussolini Canal sector, German morale in that area had collapsed. Soldiers who had fought in Russia during the brutal campaigns of the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet attacks and survived, who had proven themselves in North Africa, in Greece, in France, wrote letters home expressing fear of the Americans and Canadians who came in the night with their knives. One letter found on a German soldier killed near Anzio raid, in part that he was being sent back to the beachhead and feared for his life. "The angels with dirty faces," he wrote, "are all around us in the night with their knives." The phrase "angels with dirty faces" referred to the blackened faces of the force members. The soldier knew he was going to die. He wrote to his girlfriend in Berlin to say goodbye. It was during this period that Sergeant Tommy Prince conducted the reconnaissance mission that would make him legendary. Prince was an Ojibwe from the Broken Head First Nation in Manitoba. He had grown up hunting and trapping in the Canadian wilderness, learning skills that his ancestors had practiced for generations. He could move through terrain without leaving a trace. He could track any animal. He could remain motionless for hours while prey moved within arm's reach. His father had been a chief. His grandfather had negotiated treaty rights with representatives of the Canadian Crown. His family had served in Canadian forces during previous conflicts. Tommy Prince carried a tradition of warrior service that stretched back generations before European contact. In the force, Prince found a home where his skills were valued. The abilities he had learned hunting elk and tracking wolves translated directly into the reconnaissance work the force required. He could observe enemy positions for days without being detected. He could infiltrate areas that other soldiers could not approach. He was, in the words of his commanders, a ghost.